This is A Different Brilliant, an Aspect podcast focusing on the strengths, interests and aspirations of the autistic community. Open, authentic and engaging conversations about autism. Made for autistic people, parents and carers of children on the autism spectrum. Welcome to A Different Brilliant.
The following podcast deals with subjects such as suicidality, which may cause you distress. If this happens, please seek professional help or contact Lifeline on 13 11 14. Welcome everyone to A Different Brilliant. I am your host, Madeleine Jaine Lobsey. I am an autistic ADHD adult and super nerd of all things neurodivergent. I am joined today in the studio by Jessica Degrassi. She likes to be called Jess, who is Aspect's Positive Behaviour Support and Safeguarding Manager. And we are going to have a conversation today. I think it's going to be a great conversation. I'm an autistic person. I'm part of the autistic community, and we are going to talk about positive behaviour support. And we're really conscious of that there is some level of support and some people who have possible misconceptions or even upsets about the subject. What is fantastic is, whilst I am part of this community, I don't know very much about positive behaviour support, and this is going to be an opportunity for me to get educated and hopefully, you know, in turn for all of us to hear and get really clear for ourselves about what it is. So, welcome, Jess Degrassi.
Thank you so much, Madeleine. It's so lovely to be here today and to talk about PBS.
PBS.
Yes.
Yes. So I'm going to say PBS for the rest of this podcast, and what we are saying is positive behaviour support. So just start with maybe a little bit about what you actually do at Aspect or what your role is.
Yeah, absolutely. My role is, as you said, PBS and Safeguarding Manager. Basically, that means that I look after and I support a whole lot of amazing people in Aspect who provide either services in PBS, so that might be individualised services under things like NDIS funding. It may also include things like services in what are called our adult day programs or our programs of support model. And that means that we have a lot of people involved in those services who are what's called behaviour support practitioners, so people who are doing or implementing or supporting those people in our services who may have behaviours of concern, for example, which we'll get into, I know the nuts and bolts of soon. And then also a big part of that is around safeguarding, so making sure that people are safe. So the participants, those who are coming into our services are safe and are kept safe. So some of that may be about doing some kinds of reporting to make sure that people stay safe to government bodies or other things like that where we might have concerns about someone's wellbeing. But that's pretty much my job in a nutshell. I do a lot of different things, but anything really to do with behaviour, maybe a bit of complexity and supporting those who may have some complexity in their support needs is what I do.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, good. And I know that Aspect, Autism Spectrum Australia, is a neuro-affirming organisation, and at every level, inside and out and in all practices, is standing for causing and creating neuro-affirming practice. And even for myself, as I hear that, I hear the word behaviour, and it's an interesting one because in a neuro-affirming dialogue, often that is something that people are protective of.
Yes.
Or you could say people ought to be able to behave as they are without modification. And yet we're really talking about complexity. We're talking about, I guess, vast and diverse needs, both with people, autistic people and the people around them. And I would imagine even educating people around them to be champions and supports, etc. So can you just begin to say for us, in a nutshell, and I know this is probably a big topic, but what is it? What is positive behaviour support or PBS?
Yeah, absolutely. So PBS really started in sort of the 80s. It came out in the 80s as an alternative approach to the more, unfortunately, as we know, historically aversive, punitive practices in supporting and managing behaviour. And we can't talk about PBS without talking about behaviour. That's
about the history.
Yeah.
Well, both being responsible for, there is a history of the way people with disability have been treated throughout time.
Absolutely.
But knowing that, and like you say, there's no avoiding behaviour. Everything we do is behaviour.
Absolutely. And behaviour is extremely complex. And I think the main thing that we focus on when we talk about PBS, and we don't talk about enough, the main thing you need to be thinking about is actually quality of life. So that is the main aim, actually, of PBS, is about improving, supporting the quality of life of the person who's at the centre of that service or at the centre of PBS. And when we're looking at that, we know that there is a really complex relationship between behaviours of concern, as we'll call them, or behaviour, and we'll define that I think in a second. It'd be helpful to look into that a little bit more. But it's a complex relationship between quality of life and behaviour of concern. So we know that when someone's quality of life is poorer, we're going to potentially see more behaviour or more behaviours of concern. And then when someone's has more behaviour or more behaviours of concern, we see an increase then, a decrease in their quality of life. So it is very cyclic. So PBS does look at reducing some of those behaviours of concern, but also at the same time, it is mostly about improving the quality of life of that person.
Yeah, and I was just listening to you, Jess, and I was thinking there are people listening right now where this is very real for them. You know, this is very real for them. Either the quality of their life is diminished and sometimes profoundly diminished, and there are people that are personally, and I guess via being the role of a carer or an educator, support person, who are also impacted by behaviours that do not empower a quality of life. And that's real. They're in their homes, they're dealing with that day in, day out. And I don't want to take lightly or even just look at this conceptually. This is real people with real lives dealing with things.
Yes.
So is there any other way that positive behaviour support has been referred to, or is it referred to in any other way?
Absolutely. I think positive behaviour support has a lot of elements about it, and I think I'll start by saying that when we're talking about or sort of defining behaviour, because behaviour is everything, we all have behaviour. When we're talking about behaviours of concern, or sometimes we say challenging behaviour or behaviours that challenge, we are talking about only behaviours that may have a harm or a risk of harm to that person or other people.
And do you mean physical harm? Like, what do you mean by harm?
Yeah, absolutely. So it can be physical harm, it can be psychological harm, it can also be emotional harm. There's a whole lot of things there that we see, but generally there's an element of risk around that behaviour. I think some of the problematic relationships that PBS has had historically, that maybe some other types of therapies have tried to change behaviours that are not behaviours of concern, in terms of things like stimming or
have
flapping.
more eye contact,
Exactly.
all the basic stuff. Yeah,
all of that.
Stop having energy.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So we think, well, they're not behaviours of concern at all. We are talking about behaviours that have a risk of harm for that person or for the people around them.
And okay, so I just want to for a moment dive slightly deeper into that so I can really see it, because at the moment I get it as a concept, but so if let's say it's a risk, so let's say it's an emotional risk. Are you talking about like long-term behaviours that diminish mental health that could ultimately result in someone, like loss of life or terrible things for people? Do you mean that kind of risk as much as you mean if they're hitting themselves or harming themselves, that it's a physical risk? Do you mean that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So the physical behaviours I think are really easy
They're
to
obvious.
define. They're obvious. When there comes and when we talk about emotional harm, we might talk about things that I think more so affect the mental health of the individual.
Yeah.
And here we get into a really, I guess, complicated space in working on the choice and control of that person and their decisions, but also balancing that where they may not be able to understand that some of the actions or things they're engaging in might be hurting them in some way.
Yeah.
And that might be emotionally and psychologically as well. That would be, and those types of behaviours we work with, I think, probably less frequently, when we're talking about, because we need to be working alongside other mental health care professionals who are, again, hopefully working within that neuro-affirming framework to support people where there are behaviours where, there may be risk of suicide or risk of harm, so those type of things as well, and the long-term effects of that. But definitely we more so do work in the physical behaviours. They're more predominantly what we're supporting and trying to engage in as well.
Yeah, and we're also, to be clear, Aspect is an autism-focused organisation, yet we're talking about a lot of intersectionality of many things, including other things that people deal with physically, other things that people deal with mentally, and that's not even addressing all the other versions of what makes an intersectional life. So we're not... Whilst we are focused on autism, it's not what you're solely dealing with in your practice.
The majority of individuals, and when we look at PBS as an individualised service, there's a couple of different models of PBS that can be both a service or school-wide PBS approach versus then what we're talking about, which is more of an individualised support model where you're going in and doing more, intensive assessment and support and looking at someone. But typically when we're looking at all of those different things for that person and for that individual, we are sort of, thinking about the things that they need, the things that they want, and we're looking at the environment around them predominantly as well.
Yeah, so just to step back for a sec, when you talk about PBS, like in a school environment, that might be where someone is struggling with something in their class or in their school, and there's practices that people do that support for that child's participation in their education. And then that's sort of one side of it.
Yes.
And then the other thing you're talking about is more like there's a person in their home or in, like a one-on-one case where people are really dealing with stuff. Okay, so I'm like, okay, this is broader than I thought, than my picture of it was. So, there's so many questions running through my head that I'm trying to keep this simple for myself and for everyone. So how do you know? When should you engage and get a practitioner to address a behaviour of concern? Because here I am, I'm parenting people, or I'm personally dealing with something and I'm going, no, I'm okay, or I'm trying to work it out, or it's getting worse. What do you do and how do you know? When do you engage?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the main thing to think about, are there behaviours here that are causing harm? Or maybe have a risk of harm to that person. And it's also helpful, I think, when we're working in PBS, if it's being done well, if PBS is being done well, it should be being part of a team. So in a person's life and around that person, there's a lot of different people. You might have a child who's in school, they've got teachers, there might be teachers' aides involved. There could be other therapists like
there's
occupational
speechy,
therapists.
their OT,
And then there's mum, and then there's the family, and there's everybody around that person. And so it's very complicated because there's lots of different reactions, responses and supports that need to be put in place. And I think that it can become overwhelming. It can be very much overwhelming when you're saying, well, how do we put all this together and fit it all together to better help this person and to help their quality of life? So really it is about having, those behaviours there that are about harm, but also when people don't really know what to do. When you go, we're trying all these things, we're doing all these things, but nothing's really working or nothing's really sticking. And I need another perspective. I need some other ideas on how better to manage this. I think as well.
So hold on, I think you've got to pause there, because what you just said was really powerful, because I'm just imagining there I am in my life and I have thrown everything at this. Like this is not from lack of want or desire or effort. And I think you kind of said it lightly, but what you just said is a simple and powerful access for people is if you get to that point where you go, I just don't know what else to do, that's the time to go, okay, well, let's get another viewpoint on this.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that it's really challenging when there is, well, maybe behaviour of concern, because it's challenging for everybody around that person. You may have siblings that are getting hurt. You may have family members, mum, dad, getting hurt. There may be, particularly if we're looking at schools or services, there may be suspensions. There may be other things in place that are causing a lot of stress for everybody in that situation. And that is where accessing someone who's a behaviour support practitioner to hopefully engage with and provide a good PBS service can be really helpful.
Yeah, and I do want to keep making it real for people. Like I talk to thousands of autistic people in autistic community, and I know people that have had young boys in their life who have gotten bigger and bigger in life and become adults and, probably ought to be playing the NRL grand final or, like big guys. And suddenly things that were like just part of life can cause risk or harm when the physicality of it becomes, an issue. And that's real. Like we're saying this thing PBS, but we're talking about a life where if without support, the detriment is there's a lot of impact.
Absolutely. I think we see as well in sort of my team, we support children and then all the way up into adulthood. So I think we can see, I guess, the long-term impact when people have not managed or responded to behaviour in a way that is positive, in a way that is proactive and supportive for that individual. And things can get a lot more complex as people get older. In some ways as well, we can see that, which, this is where I think PBS can come in and can be helpful and can provide some additional supports as needed.
Yeah. So to be really frank, what's also right there for me is, oh my goodness, this poor person's about to have this entire team of people kind of go after them, so to speak, Yeah. And so my initial, I guess, even protection goes into does that person have choice and control in the situation?
Yeah. And I think the answer is they absolutely have to if PBS is being done well. When that person doesn't have choice and control, when that person doesn't have day-to-day ability to have some choice and control over what they're doing, we know that leads to poor quality of life. We can't have good quality of life without that person's choices and their control over their life being put at the forefront. So PBS does aim to, and again, I guess I'm not saying that everywhere does it perfectly, but if it is being done well, it should be all about that person, their choice and their control. There obviously is an element to which we're working with that and that idea of risk and harm to the person as well, and needing to at some points provide some additional supports where that could be problematic or that person could harm themselves or could harm other people significantly.
Yeah.
We do need to put some things in place, but it should be always with that person's voice at the centre of everything.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most critical thing you've said so far. And I'm even thinking about, so it's almost like for me, so here's my autistic brain trying to work it out, right? But it's almost like the balance check is the quality of life.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And then I go, okay, but then how do we determine quality of life? That's a big question.
It's so hard. And I think it's so hard because it's so individual.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so individual. And when we're working, particularly in the autistic community, there's such a wide range in communication needs and differences. So we have to be really mindful going into situations, particularly with someone who may be more predominantly non-speaking, may have a moderate or severe intellectual disability as well as being on the autism spectrum, that we're making sure that we've captured their voice and authentically so. And, in doing that, that is where, accessing other therapists to help support, making sure that they have ways to communicate. How would you like your behaviours supported? What would you like us to do when you're not feeling okay? Trying to answer those questions as best as possible from that person's viewpoint is really important.
Yeah, again, you're saying worlds of things in a really short amount of time.
Yes.
So if you just sort of step out of what you just said about, what you said was what's critical is the authentic autistic voice. And even the questions you asked, if we slow that down and break it out, you said, how would you like us to respond in certain situations? That's if all of us can step back for a minute, you can hear the neuro-affirming approach inside of that and the choice and control inside of that. And sometimes I think probably in the heat of moments when the behaviour is large or when, there's stuff going on that is so challenging, it could get lost, that neuro-affirming approach amongst it. And this is super nuanced with every single person being individual. So here's my question that I haven't prepared you for.
No, that's fine.
Is how do you balance all of that? Because we're not talking about, free and easy moments. We're talking about high stress, probably, situations.
Absolutely. I think the thing that can be very challenging about providing a PBS service is because it's not very clear cut. It's not very, let's just come in. When you're working with human beings, everything is complicated. Everything can be really challenging. I think that's where we try to slow it down and have a couple of different approaches that we try to structure as much as possible, because when you're looking at everything and trying to fix all the problems and fix everything that's going on, it can be really overwhelming. And so we sort of try to pare it back to look at the environment, look at what's in place for that person. What can we change? What can we adapt? What can we fix in that person's environment that is going to help them? And in making sure, of course, we're engaging that person in that discussion as much as we can through observations, through looking at how they respond to the environment. We then put, obviously, a lot of focus on the people around that person. So how are they responding? And we know that there are some complex issues here, particularly if we're looking at when, parents, families might have just had enough. It's really hard. The situation is really tough. And that might involve as well looking at what additional supports do they need. Does everybody around that person need to better support them and to make sure they can have a good life? And then it may be as well, there is a part to which we are looking at the person and going, what do they need? How can we better support them across the different environments they live in to be able to better either communicate what they need, or so that we can better set up the environment, their supports around them. Do they need or is it important to them to be able to learn a new skill, to be able to help them? So that we know that a lot of behaviour falls into the realm of it's about communication, or it's about communicating a need or being able to show or demonstrate. And so we're often thinking, what's this behaviour telling us? And so therefore, what does that person need? Do they need some support with skill development, or is it about how everyone else is operating around them that needs to change?
Okay. Ding, 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 ding.
Yes.
So,
yes.
So what I'm hearing, and tell me if this is accurate, is that historically people may have only ever looked at behaviour and gone, well, that's wrong, or that's annoying, or that's harmful.
And we need to fix that
and
person.
we need to fix that person. What you're saying that you said amongst many things was this one sentence, which is, what is that behaviour telling us? And that's an entire shift.
Yes, yes.
Because now we're interested in what is being communicated that's not being communicated verbally or not being communicated straightforwardly. Like what is this communication that's trying to be said?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that's powerful.
And I think it's very that is being the shift, and that is the difference, I would hope, with PBS really, if it's done well. That's that shift from we need to fix that person. It's looking at that person, but it is looking at the environment. It's looking at how people respond. It's looking at all of that and trying to put it all together in a plan with some strategies, some better supports to hopefully keep that person safe. But also the most important thing, of course, as we keep coming back to is around quality of life and improving that quality of life.
Can we for a moment, that's very good, can we for a moment just expand on what you mean when you say environment? Because it makes sense to me that you'd want to be looking at the way the people are in their environment are responding to them. Just say a bit more about what you're including when you say environment.
We know that the world is not set up well for autistic people. So that is where we often start, is we're looking at, we're looking not at the world, hopefully, but we're looking at that person's world. So where they're in, they might be in school, they might be in a day program, they might be out in the community. What does that look like? At home, what does that look like? So we're looking at environments, and we're looking at, are there any changes we can put in place here? And an example of this may be something like, if someone, we know that in a lot of environments that are noisy or loud or, something busy, that's where we're more likely to see some of those risk behaviours or behaviours that result in harm. So automatically we're going, okay, so what can we change about that environment to make sure that it's less likely that person needs to engage in those behaviours, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Yeah, that's very clear. All right, so you keep saying positive behaviour support. So I guess I want to know, and you keep saying if it's done well.
Yes.
So I'm like, okay, well, if it's done well and it's positive, what does it look like? Like, give us an example, or what does it look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully it's starting with looking at what we call, and it's a very technical term around sort of functional behaviour assessment, and that term is a challenging one, but that in essence is saying, well, why is this happening? Why? That's what it's about. It's really looking at why, and I think what we tend to do then is we're looking at what's happening before the behaviour. When is it more likely? Is there anything that triggers or sets it off or makes it more likely to happen? Those sort of things we're looking into. We're then looking at the behaviour itself, and we're trying to establish, well, what are the needs here? What are they trying to communicate? What are they trying to tell us? And then we're obviously looking at the responses to what happens after it occurs, because that's going to give us a lot of information. So, for example, we might be saying someone who might headbang significantly on and might hurt their head, those kind of things as well. If it happens when, people are not paying them a lot of attention or they're bored, that's telling us a lot about the behaviour automatically. But if it happens when people come to them and try to offer them an activity or something that, a particular activity like a puzzle, and suddenly we see that, that's when it occurs, that tells us something very different. The first example is potentially more about, getting connection with people, being able to engage with people. The second one is probably more about providing that person with a way to say, no, stop, I don't want to do that right now. Those are the type of things that we're looking at then as a start. And then from there, obviously, we're hoping for that environmental change. So we're looking at all those things that might make the behaviour more likely, as I said before, if it's busier or louder or there's changes to routine, how we better supporting that person, setting them up for success, looking at helping adjust their routine, those sort of things as well. And then obviously we might look at, it always happens, this child always flips the table and runs out of the classroom anytime they're provided with a particular reading task. So what we might do is go, well, actually, for the moment, do they need to do that? Is that important? We're reassessing all of that. What is it about the task? Can we change it? Is there something to it that's causing that? And we're trying to put some of those changes in place. And then the other element to that, and this is where positive behaviour support gets really complicated in terms of we're then looking at, does that person need another way to communicate, or do they need another way? And obviously people should be listening to people when they're communicating, because this is telling us something quite significant about their needs. But we also might look at, okay, well, do we need to provide them with a visual or something that helps them communicate no, stop, or something that helps them communicate I want to play. I come over here, or I need help. So we might be looking at all of those type of things as well and going, does the person want to learn? Is it necessary, obviously, for them to learn those things? And will it be helpful to them? So I think they're sort of the main things we're looking at. And then alongside all of that, and this is often sometimes the priority when we're moving in to support people under PBS, might be around sort of like a crisis response. So how are we supporting that person when they are escalating? So when things go wrong, making sure everyone's safe. The only aim is really around de-escalating and making sure that person feels safe and everybody around them safe as well. So they're sort of the main elements that we're pulling into when we're looking at what does it actually look like. And then I think the bigger part that we often forget is around something we call implementation. So, everyone might get together, we've got a beautiful plan as to what's going to happen. There's all these strategies, you're going, okay, but they're not actually implemented every day with that person. And so that's part of, what does that look like? How do we make sure that these strategies just don't go in a box and everyone forgets about them? And then, of course, reviewing. So as I said, humans are complicated. PBS is based on science, but it is also not an exact science. Sometimes we're working with people who can't always communicate exactly what it is that's might be causing them to be upset or overwhelmed. So we have to change as people change and constantly review and make sure that things are working. So that's a very long sort of summary of everything around what happens when you're sort of accessing or when you should be engaging in good PBS supports.
Yeah, that's what it looks like when it's done well. All right, well, here we go. I've got, I guess, a final question for you. This is not a walk in the park. Historically, definitely not. Yeah. We've evolved dramatically. We now have neuro-affirming conversation and practice. You're evolving constantly. And even the day-to-day work, I'm sure, is not a walk in the park. So why do you love it?
I think that what you pulled on earlier around the why, for me, that is one of the big things that I love. I love meeting new people. I love seeing new things. I love humans, I think, is something. And I enjoy working out why. And I think then from there, the other passion part, I think for myself, and I would say I can probably speak on behalf of my team, is around seeing the quality of life, the improvements that we see, someone getting outside the house and accessing the community where they haven't been able to safely before, because we've been able to put in place supports with that person and work with them. And I think that it is something that I've really enjoyed seeing change in the PBS space over the last couple of years is the neuro-affirming approaches and building in and making sure that each part of that process that we might go through when we're using or doing PBS implements and has that person's voice really strongly throughout it. I think they're the main things that I love and I really enjoy about PBS.
Yeah. Well, you are clearly passionate about it, and I know that you would have made a difference that is unimaginable and unquantifiable to people, and we really appreciate you spending the time to tackle this and define it and tell us really what positive behaviour support is. So thank you for your time, Jess.
Thank you very much, Madeleine. It's been lovely. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to A Different Brilliant, an Aspect podcast focusing on the strengths, interests and aspirations of the autistic community. If you would like to learn more, visit our website, aspect.org.au, to listen to past episodes or send us a message. Make sure to like or subscribe to A Different Brilliant on your podcast app.